We're talking about the wonderful wide world of certifications and marketing claims, which is another one that I find daunting to be given 20 minutes to cover. And there's a lot that we don't get to cover today, so I've tried to find the ones that I think are the most important for you to know about and for us to discuss. And we're going to do claims and standards on beginning of life, on sourcing, bio-based, and then we're going to do claims and certifications for end of life. And I'll tell you why when we get to that part, we're focusing only on compostability. So starting with bio-based. And I want to start with the wacky. So the FTC has conducted a bit of consumer perception research, which I envision as average reasonable consumers, that's an FTC term, average reasonable consumers coming together in a room, and then whoever the FTC had do the study, they say, well, this package says it's renewable. What does that make you think? And they found craziness. Reasonable consumers are likely to interpret that claim to mean that the item is made with recycled content, is recyclable and biodegradable, right? This is if something is marketed as being a renewable material, which is wild. So the FTC encourages those making marketing claims to minimize the risk by saying exactly what it is that makes that material or product renewable, as in say with clarity, this package or product is renewable because it's made from this plant-based feedstock, and this plant is rapidly renewable, and therefore this package or product is renewable. And no marketing professional anywhere really wants to say that, right? And they also give appropriate guidance to say you have to qualify your claim based on the extent to which renewable material is used. As in, if it's got 5% renewable material, you can still make that claim, but your claim needs to tell people that it's 5% renewable material. Now, they don't, of course, give guidance that's specific, because the FTC is notorious for not giving specific guidance. But they do say, in a nutshell, you have to avoid consumer deception, either intentional or unintentional. And this top craziness about the things consumers think when they see the word renewable means that there's likely to be a lot of unintentional consumer deception with these claims, so we have to be careful. With any environmental marketing claim under the FTC's watch, they advise us to have scientifically based substantiating evidence. And that's where ASTM comes in. I have to give a disclaimer. This whole slide deck is basically nothing but acronyms and numbers, so you've been warned. So ASTM D6866 is the chief method, the most prevalent method of getting a scientific substantiation for the percentage of the material that is bio-based. And it's done with a radiocarbon analysis. So literally figuring out how much of the carbon in the material has recently been in the atmosphere versus the portion, if any, of the carbon that has been underground for a long time, since the age of the dinosaurs, right? So that's the name of the game. And then in Europe, there is CENTS 16137, which as far as I can tell is basically the same thing. So based on this ASTM method of determining bio-based content, one can get a certification from the USDA BioPreferred program, which we'll hear about tomorrow from Marie. And the way, in short, that this program works is that there is a minimum required percentage of bio-based content as determined by ASTM D6866 necessary in order for the product to bear the USDA BioPreferred certification. So I've done my best to cherry pick what I think very well may be the relevant categories for us today. I think the takeaway is that it varies. All of these, I think, are fairly high. The lowest one on here is minimum 48% bio-based material for cutlery to be given the certification that it is a bio-based product. Over in Europe, the two chief certification methods are OK-Vinsat and DIN CertCo, and they are based on that CENTS 16137, which is again another radiocarbon measurement method of determining how much of the carbon in the product was recently in the atmosphere versus long-term underground. Both of these certification schemes have ways of denoting how much of the content is bio-based. So you see on the DIN CertCo on the bottom, The language on the top says between 20 and 50%, 50 and 85%, or over 85%. If the bio-based content is below 20%, there is no DIN-CertCo certification seal given. OK Vinsat, you see on the top left, there are 4 stars. The number of stars, I don't know if anybody knows this when they see this, but the number of stars denotes the percentage of bio-based content. So 4 stars is 80 to 100, 3 is 60 to 80, 2 is 40 to 60, and then 1 is 20 to 40. So again, less than 20% bio-based content means you don't get the Vinsat certification. RSB, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. This certification can be given to any product that has at least 25% bio-based content as determined by that ASTM method. But now we're going a step further because the RSB certification scheme also has criteria in place for sustainable production of the bio-based feedstock. So not just to say that, yes, this percentage of the carbon came from plant or animal-based sources, but to also say that there's some level of assurance and trust given that that feedstock was responsibly grown and managed. So there are criteria in there for measures taken on soil quality, toxicity, the chemicals used in the production of the feedstock. The other one that we see is the ISCC Plus certification, and this is for any feedstock-based material, but it's different than the ones based on ASTM or its European equivalent, and frankly, I don't really understand it. It says it uses the mass balance approach, and I take it to mean that whatever portion of bio-based feedstock that is used, if it is distributed or not distributed amongst a number of products, any of the products can claim some level of being bio-based as long as the total amount claimed doesn't exceed the feedstock that was brought in. And if that makes sense to you, then you're a couple steps ahead of me. It has optional criteria for sustainability and responsibility criteria about the growth and management of the feedstock, as in one can elect not to use the criteria for soil quality and air quality and human toxicity, et cetera, or someone pursuing the certification can go through the added rigor of getting that part of the certification undertaken, but regardless of if you elect to or if you don't, you still get the same ISCC Plus certification. On the crop level, there are a few different certifications that we see. Now, this is not related at all to certifying the bio-based content of a product or package. We're talking about certifying that the crop, if it is a crop, certifying that the crop was responsibly grown and managed. So the working landscape certificate is one that is crop agnostic. It can be used for any grown crop. And it's got a similar set of criteria as I've been mentioning. Interestingly, this one has criteria for non-GMO, yes? Yes, I believe so. Can anyone? Yes, Aaron says yes, right. Yes. And it works like a REC for renewable energy. And I don't know if we're all familiar with how that works, but basically the farm, the grower that gets certified, they can sell their crop and then they can also sell their working landscape certificate because the crop is likely to go to some facility that processes this certified crop and also a whole bunch of other crop that's not certified. So there's no real practically reasonable chain of custody for this. So the farmer then sells the working landscape certificate and the buyer can then claim that they are using certified by the Working Landscapes Program, certified feedstock. So the same as if renewable energy goes into the grid, the buyer of the REC, the renewable energy credit, can claim that they're using renewable energy even though the grid mix is part renewable and then all the other stuff in there. For specific crops, there are few certifications. Here I'm showing the roundtable on responsible soy and also Bonsucro for sugarcane. There's another certification out there for palm oil, which I don't believe we're using a whole lot of to make bioplastics, but we could. For wood-based bioplastics, there's obviously SFI and FSC, but we're not going to go there today because I presume most of us are familiar with forestry certification. These two standards have, they're best known as certifications, not standards, but two types of certification. One for production, as in this sugarcane farm is meeting the criteria of Bon Sucro, and then there's also a chain of custody certification saying that that Bon Sucro certified crop has verifiably made its way up the supply chain to the end user. Okay, so that's all for sourcing. For the end of life, I very deliberately chose to focus on claims of compostability. On the one hand, there's no real standard or certification for things like reuse or recyclable. There's no such thing as a certified recyclable item, so I have nothing to talk about. But I didn't want to talk about standards and claims for biodegradability because as an informal stance of the SPC, we don't believe in making claims of biodegradability. The reason for that is that the reason for that is that we believe compostability is the best way of denoting that a product's biodegradable quality is actually going to result in an environmental benefit. As in, if the benefits of biodegradability are to be realized, it needs to be realized at a composter. Because I told you that when things biodegrade in a landfill, it doesn't turn into wildflowers, and we have this big greenhouse gas impact that we'd rather avoid. And we also don't want this creation of what could be perceived as a litter-friendly material. So I'm not going to talk about how to certify a product as being biodegradable, but there's plenty to talk about with compostability. So we'll start again with the FTC. And fortunately for all of us, the average reasonable consumer is not thoroughly confused by a claim of compostability. They get it. That's good. So the guidance put forth by the FTC, again, says you have to have competent and reliable scientific evidence. The material has to result in usable compost. It has to compost during the same time frame as the materials with which it's composted. And of course, they don't tell you what that means. That's up to us to decide. And last but not least, you have to prominently qualify your claim if such facilities are not available to a substantial majority of consumers, which is kind of cheeky because they're not, and the FTC knows they're not. But basically, in practice, this means that if you say something is compostable, you kind of have to say, but you might not be able to find an industrial composter where you live, because again, they're very limited. So starting with competent and reliable scientific evidence, the way that this has been done is through one of these two ASTM standards, D6400 or D6868. D6400 is the standard to be used for a compostable plastic. So something like a plastic cup or clamshell or piece of cutlery that in itself is composed of plastic, D6400 is your standard. If the compostable plastic is used as a treatment or attachment on something else, like say a fiber-based item, then D6868 is the appropriate standard. Interestingly, I think we all can easily visualize there's a ton of certified compostable products out there that have no bioplastic on them whatsoever. So they still use D6868 even though it wasn't intended for them. But I guess that's better than one more ASTM standard, right? Both the standards are basically the same. And what they dictate is this. The material has 180 days, and then by that point, 90% of it has to be measurably converted into carbon dioxide, because that's the indicator that microorganisms are breaking down the product on the molecular level and turning the carbon that was in the molecule in the solid into the gaseous carbon dioxide. That's what happens in aerobic biodegradation. So 90% of it has to be chemically transformed. 90% of it has to, as the disintegration criteria, 90% has to pass through a 2 millimeter sieve. And then last but not least, there cannot be any phytotoxicity, ecotoxicity, or heavy metals. As in, the stuff has to break down in, put air quotes around this, a reasonable amount of time, and it can't be unhealthy when it does that. Once an item has sufficiently passed through this ASTM test method, then it is eligible for BPI certification, BPI being the Biodegradable Products Institute. So they are a certifying body, and they, through their partner at NSF, they do independent validation of the ASTM test results. They say, okay, everything looks good, and now your product is certified compostable. Because remember, ASTM is not a certification method, it's simply a test standard. So BPI is the one who puts the seal of approval on the test and does the actual certification. At the SPC, we operate our how to compost label. So this is what's intended to be the claim on package, if a company so chooses, and of course we hope that you do. It builds off the success of our How to Recycle program, and the idea is that we're training consumers, whether they know it or not, to look for the How to Recycle message, to learn about the recyclability of the product. The How to Compost label mirrors the same design, and often it can be literally side by side to a How to Recycle label. So for example, a product might say, if clean and dry, you should recycle it. If it's soiled with food waste, it's great for composting, not so much for recycling. So this is intended to be the on-pack label that builds on the BPI certification, that builds on the ASTM standard, that builds on the FTC guidance. Okay, so now the fun part. So ASTM, both the standards, they have their 180-day time frame, right? In 180 days, 90% of the material has to be composted safely. Cedar Grove is a big, important industrial composter that serves the Seattle area, and they were the first, and well, maybe not the first, they were the loudest to say, hey, this ASTM process is not reflective of what we do here at Cedar Grove. And remember, I showed you in my previous slide deck the certified compostable cutlery that was still fairly intact and recognizable as cutlery in the compost. That was ASTM tested, probably BPI certified compostable material that did not meet the time frame of the composter. So Cedar Grove said, you know what? This certification is not enough for us. Something has to also, or instead, be certified on the ground at our operation, and we will issue a Cedar Grove certification of compostability. Didn't make a ton of people very happy, but can you blame them, right? What we think is very interesting is recently Cedar Grove has partnered with a number of other composting organizations to create the CMA, not the Country Music Awards, but the Compost Manufacturing Alliance. I was confused too. And they've recently created we think it's a sister organization, the Compost Feedstock Testing Institute. And I write brand new here because this is as in like last week we saw this and said, what's the Compost Feedstock Testing Institute? This must be new. And it is. This is brand new, but this is field testing. So ASTM is lab testing for supposed compostability. The CMA, and I guess we'll call it the CFTI, is on the ground, in situ, field testing of compostability. So not just at Cedar Grove anymore, but 5 different types of composting operations. And I'm not fluent enough to name them all, but it's like aerated static pile and the windrow and the very verbose convoluted process that Cedar Grove uses. And the idea is that a product can be tested through this method and you get real results back about how the product did at the major composting facilities. So sort of a real-life verification that it's likely to work in the actual conditions it will experience if it gets composted. Over in Europe, there's EN 13432, which is, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of the ASTM standards I mentioned earlier. Same name of the game. The material has its time frame before it must have been utilized by microbes. It has to be sufficiently disintegrated into really little pieces. And of course, it cannot have any toxicity during that process. Another point I wanted to make. The difference between the ASTM standard and this EN standard is that there is this mark that can be used if something passes the EN 13432 standard. So it's not a certification, but kind of. Yes, Nadia?
Why is it that the American market generally does not accept this test as a substitute for the ASTM?
Good question. I have no clue. I think the preference in the States is BPI certification, that they've kind of been on top of the game for a while, and I think that we're all just accustomed to looking for BPI certification.
But even if you want to get BPI certification and avoid the ASTM because you've already got that one, they don't accept it. They want you to do the ASTM even if you've got the EN certificate.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That sounds unfair though, because they really are basically equivalent standards.
Yeah, that's why I'm
Anyone in the room got a better answer than me? Yes, please.
There are two primary differences, and there is some reciprocity. So valid test results by an accredited lab are accepted, but with B6868, the way that BPI currently treats plastic coatings or coatings of any kind is they apply the 1% rule on the basis weight of the coating itself. So any material within that coating that exceeds 1%. Whereas EN 13432 applies the 1% rule to the full package weight. So your threshold levels for what has to be tested are different with regard to that stipulation. So D6868 is up for revision in the ASTM committee, and there is hope by some that there's going to be a reconciliation just based on the science. It's not politics, it's science.
Thank you.
I do want to make one correction, though, on what you said.
Please.
The standard for 6868 and D6400 is not disintegration within 180 days. That is currently 12 weeks. The 180 days applies to biodegradation. It does not apply to disintegration. And that's a huge distinction because the visible fragments over 2 millimeters are what a composter sees. No composter is out there measuring CO2.
Excellent point. You said 12 weeks?
It's currently 12 weeks. EN 13432 is currently re-examining if they're going to change their standard to 8 weeks.
That's very interesting. And of course, the chorus heard from the industrial composters is that their time frames are always faster than what ASTM dictates. So,
Some say that and some don't say that.
good point. Correct, right? Yep, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so in the US, there's ASTM and there's BPI. In Europe, there's EN 13432. And Vinsat, again, with their different certifications for compostability. Vinsat has two. They have one certification for industrial compostability, which you see on the top, and then another one for home compostability. And in short, to get the home compostability certification, the packager product has to pass through that EN 13432, except at an accelerated time frame, or no, excuse me, a longer time frame at a lower temperature. The idea being that a home composting operation is never going to reach the temperature that an industrial composting operation will, but it also doesn't have that same stringent requirements for things to be done fast because it's not an industrial scale business. There is, to our knowledge, no other certification out there for home compostability. I understand that there has been a lot of discussion about whether or not an ASTM test method should be created, but as of today, this is the only one. So often we'll see products sold in North America that have this European OK home compost certification. Okay.
Belgium or Europe?
It's a Belgian certification, but
The EU, is it broader?
I don't think there's any official rules that say where it should and should not be used, but it is Belgian.
But is it used outside of Belgium?
Yes, yes, yep,
Okay.
yep. Yeah, basically everywhere. Okay, we have maybe a minute for questions if there are any. Shri?
I have a question on that bio-preferred labeling. For different applications, it looks like different content of bio-based is required. In fact, I saw for packaging it was greater than 85%. Is that right? Why is that?
It was packing materials, I think, which is,
Actually, the percentages that you had up on the chart on your slide are for procurement. If you want the federal government to procure those products, you have to meet that minimum standard. If you want to be certified for the label, the minimum is 25%. And then on the package, you can put whatever the percentage is. So you can have one that's 26% and one that's 75%. It doesn't matter to us as long as they're 25%. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. We actually have two parts of our program. And so those percentages are higher because it's for procurement for the federal government. They get a preference. So in order to get that preference, you have to get that higher percentage.
really glad you're here. Oh, thank you. Joe?
Mine's not a question, it's a request for the brand panel tomorrow, if they can touch on this a little, because us as manufacturers, we're really confused with one to go for? You know, what is the acceptable one? So that's just a request for tomorrow, please.
So what you're asking is for more the brand owners for
That was
So,
directed
no,
at
in
you,
terms of
Rachel.
what we would consider if we were to go with a certification, what, I just wanna make sure I'm like, I'm not sure we will certify anything yet here, but I'll present the thoughts between now and tomorrow morning.
Could do one more question, if there are any. Okay. Then I will hand it over to Nina for our last module. Thank you.